going on, everybody? It's the Bulls Show, aka Aidan, and welcome back to another video. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be reacting to a rumor around the Chicago Bulls, I guess you could say, about Derrick Jones Jr. and his future on this Chicago Bulls team. At the end of the day, he's an unrestricted free agent for the Chicago Bulls and probably looking for a little bit of a pay rise in terms of his contract, and we'll be discussing whether or not it'll be likely that he receives that contract from the Chicago Bulls, and also we'll be talking about his season a little bit more in depth in this video as well. But before we get started, please like and subscribe to the Bulls Show, turn notifications on, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts about Derrick Jones Jr. and his likelihood to return for the Chicago Bulls next year. Do you think it's a high possibility? Do you think it's a low possibility? Stuff like that. It's very important that we have to discuss these things in terms of guys like Derrick Jones Jr. because we just don't know whether or not he's going to return for the Chicago Bulls. It's a very up in the air, but a lot of people have different opinions and different interpretations of that. So feel free to let me know in the comments below. Now, something I did want to base this off is actually what Casey Johnson wrote in an article, I believe. And basically, he wrote in the article that Derrick Jones Jr., obviously his status for the Chicago Bulls is unrestricted and is unlikely to return to the Chicago Bulls. That's something that's very intriguing to me because at the end of the day, I never would have personally thought that'd be unlikely for Derrick Jones Jr. to return. But if you do look at everything that's been happening for the Chicago Bulls this season, I think a lot of people probably could have maybe had that guess. I personally was a little bit naive to that fact. But again, when you see Derrick Jones Jr. not get opportunities at the end of the season where he very rarely played any playoff games, for a guy that's 25 years old looking for a contract, it's his contract year at the end of the day, wants a pay rise in terms of his NBA contract, then I definitely think returning to the Chicago Bulls is probably the most unlikely option of them available. But let's talk about his contract a little bit, ladies and gentlemen, and whether or not he deserves to be with the Chicago Bulls team next season, depending on the money that he made this year, and if he's looking to increase his contract for the next year. So, Derrick Jones Jr., I believe, made $9.7 million for the Chicago Bulls this year. That's quite a lot of money for Derrick Jones Jr. services, and all things considered, he did have a relatively average season for the Chicago Bulls, averaging 5.6 points per game, 3.3 rebounds, 0.6 assists, with 51 games played, a couple of injuries here and there, but again, it's a very interesting player in my opinion. Now, with that money, again, probably was a little bit overpriced, but with all things considered, Derrick Jones Jr. might be looking for more, as I've said countless times already in this video. And that's something that's very intriguing, and I don't know how the Chicago Bulls will respond to that, which is probably why Casey Johnson talked about his unlikeliness to return with the Chicago Bulls team next year. So I want to talk a little bit about him. Derrick Jones Jr., in my opinion, is a guy that we didn't use to his capabilities, at his fullest capabilities, while also him not really delivering on the opportunities that he provided. For an example, he's probably the biggest alley-oop threat we have on this team. He's obviously the biggest threat we could have used out in transition. He's probably the biggest threat in terms of a pick and roll as well, and very rarely do you see those opportunities for Derrick Jones Jr. to really play in that avenue. What his main go-to for the Chicago Bulls this season was either to play a small ball center, which again, I don't think he was terrible at, but definitely not his prime position, not averaging great rebounds in that position either, or sit in the corner and knock down the three-point shot, which he did okay at for the most part, but at the end of the season, he did come down a little bit in his percentage, and he only averaged 32.8% from the three-point line, which is not good for Derrick Jones Jr. either. So I can safely say, as a Chicago Bulls fan, even though Derrick Jones Jr. is someone that I really do like, someone that I think could be very valuable to this team, someone that, again, between Troy Brown and Derrick Jones, I personally would pick Derrick Jones Jr., I can honestly say, hand on heart, that we did not use him to his fullest effect with this Chicago Bulls team. That's not to say that he didn't have a terrible season, he didn't have a great season, his season was average in my eyes, but we could have used him a little bit better and used him in more ways where he could be effective. Now, with Derrick Jones Jr., I guess the question also has to be asked, do you bring him back for the Chicago Bulls next year? If there's an opportunity where Derrick Jones is open to return to the Chicago Bulls and the Chicago Bulls want to keep Derrick Jones Jr., do you bring him back? My answer to that question is, if he's looking for a pay rise, for an example, he made $9.7 million. If he's looking to make around $10 to $12 million next season and for his future contract in the NBA, my answer personally would be no. I've heard a lot of things about Derrick Jones Jr. Obviously, he's a Chicago Bulls fan. He even called himself a super fan at one stage earlier on in the year, which made me a very happy man because he just signed for the Chicago Bulls and he was saying all those positive things. But as much as it's about being a fan of the Chicago Bulls, and that's obviously something that I'd love to have Bulls fans on a Bulls team. It makes perfect sense because they understand what the team's going to be about and how hard you have to work for the team. But at the end of the day, you got to know people's values, and sometimes people want to overvalue themselves rather than, I guess, being that right value. And Derrick Jones Jr. has every right to feel confident and back himself at what the value that he wants. That's something that every NBA player should have. But as an organization, as the Chicago Bulls themselves, sometimes overvaluing a player is not always the right way to go. Again, sometimes it is. With Zach LaVine, I don't think Zach LaVine deserves a max contract based on last season, and he might be overvaluing himself. But for that type of player, you might be willing to overvalue and overpay for Zach LaVine. For Derrick Jones Jr., I'm not sure it's in the same way because he didn't have the best of seasons. The Bulls didn't use him effectively, and having more money just doesn't simply make sense in my eyes for the Chicago Bulls, in all honesty. So that's my answer to the question. I don't think we should bring back Derrick Jones Jr. if he's looking for more money. If he's looking for around the same money or maybe even a little bit less, which is very hard to believe, then I could definitely see that as a possibility. But all things considered, it looks like Derrick Jones Jr., the likelihood of him returning to the Chicago Bulls is a high possibility at this point. I also have a question to ask in terms of Derrick Jones Jr. Where do you think he'll go? Most important thing as well, if he's not staying on this team, where is he going to go? I've heard a lot of people saying the Lakers. Again, I feel like everybody that's a free agent is linked to the Lakers at one point or another, so I don't really know how that will go. But again, feel free to let me know in the comments below about Derrick Jones Jr. and the likelihood of his return. Do you want to see him return? Do you think he will return? And if he doesn't return, where do you think he'll go? Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you're new. A little bit of a shorter video. I'm trying to, I guess, balance it out a little bit. I know people like the longer videos, but I also like the shorter videos as well, kind of bringing you some of the news and situations like that. We're talking more about players and their individual seasons. If you haven't noticed, I've been trying to, I guess, put a lot of people's individual seasons into certain videos. So I talked about Kobe, Patrick, Io, and all together in one video. Today I'm going to be talking about Derrick Jones. I'll be making video about the big three later on, and we'll continue from there. So this is my version of Derrick Jones Jr. I think personally we should not bring him back for extra money if that's what he's looking for, and I think his season's been relatively average, and we haven't used him effectively enough for him to, I guess, want to come back and for us to bring him back as well. That's my personal opinion. With all that being said, we will have to look for a wing defender if Derrick Jones Jr. does leave as well, so keep your eyes out on that. Take care.